The first time I met Giuliana, she was in the audience at my job talk in 2005. I was nervous, needless to say, and I made it to the question and answer session. And I was quietly amazed by Giuliana's intellect, passion, and articulation of so many of the ideas that I care about so deeply. And there was another woman in the audience as well, who was equally formidable and impressive, Svetlana Boehm, who many of you know. I couldn't believe my good fortune at having a job talk with scholars that were so engaged with visual language and who really entirely got it. I had thought they were going to tear me apart. Giuliana is such a North Star for so many of us. It's very exciting to be here at this moment and to celebrate her. There are many, many people who have brought this evening into being, who have worked to bring this together. And I'd like to give thanks to Emily Amendola, Denise Oberdan, Laura Fromm, Katerina Buren, Joanna Pimenta, Julia Sharp, Emilio Vavarella, Spinney, Christian Restrepo, Mary Park, John Quackenbush, Aaron Pirano Garrison from AFVS, and Dan Byers and Danny Shun, and Laura Saray and Francesca Williams from the CCVA, and Alex Vasile from HFA. This afternoon we spent, there were two panels at the Graduate School of Design. We spent the afternoon hearing from alumni of the Film and Visual Studies and the Graduate School of Design programs. I'd like to warmly welcome the Dean of the Graduate School of Design, Sarah Whiting, who is also Louis Cert Professor of Architecture. And Sarah, thank you so much for being here. And Giuliana, thank you for bringing us all together.
Thank you. Thank you. I was never Giuliana's student. I was a little overwhelmed actually this afternoon. There's no way that I can match that. We've been colleagues, you can say, here over these last 6 years, but we haven't had much time to spend much time together. But every time I see you, I feel like there's sort of a little bubble that surrounds us of happiness and pleasure and intellectual joy. I don't even remember when I first met you, but I'm going to sort of step away from being dean for a moment, and I'm going to step backwards to a moment in time when Giuliana Bruno first rocked my world. 37 years ago. Okay, it's fall 1997. I'm a first-year student in the Master of Architecture program at Princeton, a program and a time that was particularly oriented to embracing theory and using it to stretch the boundaries of the discipline of architecture. Giuliana's article, Ramble City, Postmodernism and Blade Runner, had just appeared in the pages of October, which was being sold in the school's supply store alongside Rotring pen nibs, paper, cardboard, balsa wood, and other drawing and model supplies. Blade Runner itself was only 5 years old. Everyone in the school had seen it, as well as Blue Velvet, Down by Law, She's Gotta Have It, among other films. When I say everyone, you do have to realize that there were only about 25 of us in the whole MArch and PhD program at Princeton at the time. We were a very small cohort, but most of us read the same books, saw the same exhibitions, drank the same beers at Annex Restaurant, not the same actual glasses, but you understand, across from the university. Today, the Annex and most of that culture has disappeared, but rather than wax nostalgic, a retreat that is so very tempting at this particular moment, let me dive in to explain why it is that Giuliana's article had such an impact on this little group. So Ramble City is a beautiful and inspiring piece. It elucidated the distinctions across scholarship on postmodernism in the visual arts, in the social sciences, in literature, and in architecture. So it's important to note that the School of Architecture at Princeton in 1987 was experiencing a seismic shift between architectural postmodernism of Michael Graves and Ralph Lerner, and then the literary and visual postmodern theory being brought in by Mark Wigley, Beatrice Colomina, Michael Hayes, and Tony Fidler. Michael was there for just 1 year. Being in that school at that time was like watching an intense tennis match. We students were swinging our heads from one side to the other, absorbing the challenges, the hits, and the scores. Like all of Giuliana's writing, this short article is beautifully written. And as an aside, Martin, I would say that it's not just images that have the fluidity to carry your mind forward, but beautiful writing, and I think Giuliana's writing in particular, is somehow manages to avoid being singular and prescriptive. It, like images, draws you in many different directions. So this beautifully written article manages to thread together an incredibly diverse set of references with a grace that makes you feel, as you read it, that you're sitting at a tasty dinner with all of the references. Conversation is flying, but never veering into showmanship or irrelevance. Maybe that's a form of entanglements, as Juliana would say. As I reread the article recently, I realized that in addition to talking through the various forms of postmodernism, the piece, and this is 1987, also foretells our discipline's subsequent focus, and maybe not just architectures, but theories generally, on topics including identity, economics, climate, globalization, immigration, the vernacular, methodology, and even fake news. It's actually astonishing to reread it today. So the same is true for Giuliana's other writing, which continued and continues to influence my field with its specificity, its provocations, its beauty, and its relevance. I know that she has had an important impact on the GSD, on my colleagues, and on our students over all of these years. And if I can take some solace at losing her to the freedom of her liberation from the academy, and yes, you are right to read envy in that characterization, it's that I know she will continue writing, and writing will continue rocking our worlds. I'll just say that we need it more than ever right now, because she continues to signal a way of theorizing that couldn't be more urgent for all of us. This afternoon included presentations and panels by Giuliana's former students around two themes: elements of media matter and sensing place, thinking space. These students shared many stories of Giuliana's impact, but also show her influence on their own trajectories, which gives me optimism for our future. So with that optimism in the air, let me get down to my job, which is introducing this evening's event. We're treated to two keynotes, one by artist and filmmaker Isaac Julien, and the second by philosopher Emanuele Coccia. And then a roundtable discussion including both Isaac and Emanuele, along with Juliana, and moderated by art historian Eva Lacher-Burkhardt. I suppose that everyone in this room knows all of these characters well, but I'm still obligated to briefly situate them for anyone who doesn't. So, in addition to his work as an artist and filmmaker, Isaac Julien is Distinguished Professor of the Arts at Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz. He had a retrospective last year at the Tate Britain and has received numerous awards. He's collaborating, as we speak, with Juliana on a book on Lino Bobardi, which is apparently in the proof stage, so I think we'll get some glimpses of it in the discussion this evening. Emanuele Coccia, who is no stranger to this room, teaches at the École des Hautes Études in Paris and has been a visiting professor here at Harvard, as well as at the universities of Tokyo, Buenos Aires, and Columbia. He's published numerous books and has curated numerous exhibitions. His current project, working with Alessandro Michel, the creative director of Gucci, is on a publication that traces the relationship between fashion and philosophy, and you'll note that he wears it well. Eva Lacher-Burkhardt is William Dorr Boardman Professor of Fine Arts here at Harvard. Her focus is on 18th and 19th century French art. She's also written extensively on contemporary art. Her topics range from necklines in David's paintings to the invention of drawing as a medium. And finally, Juliana. If you don't know everything about her already, I'm not sure how you got here, but let me be fair and cite some info for her as well. She's the Emmett Blakeney Gleason Professor of Visual and Environmental Studies and a GSD faculty affiliate. Her work, as I've already noted, offers up a delectable menu of the visual arts, architecture and the environment, and media. She's published 7 award-winning books, 200 essays, and we surely will see her publish many, many more. So the run of show is that Isaac will start us off, followed by Emanuele, then the round table. Sit back and enjoy the performance.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and it's a great honor to be here in this space, which I used to teach at all those years ago. So you'll probably understand if I go a little bit down memory lane. And of course, it's a great honor to be here to celebrate Giuliana Bruno, my great friend. So, just to start off, I guess I would say it's at the beginning of Giuliana's first masterpiece, Street Walking on a Ruined Map. She described her historical curiosity about the world, especially about film and its evolution as a form of cultural production. She describes her curiosity as a product of two forces, a desire to know and a lust of the eyes. She notes that these two distinctive impulses manifest in two different lenses through which she sees the world, the microscopic and the telephoto. Thus armed, she whisks us through the ruined map, a fragmented cartography of Alvera Notare's filmic archive and its relationship. I should say its entanglement with the city of Naples. The two lenses sweep over the world, and Giuliana always ensures that the images they capture are brought into focus for her reader, woven together and recombined into a fabulous tapestry, so much greater than some of its parts. We're barely 2 pages into the text, 2 pages into Giuliana's career, which of course shortly hereafter would become legendary. And already her writing captivates. Giuliana's exacting vision gives us a new kind of depth and perception. She begins us intimately close with her subjects in a way that is so rare in academic theory. This critical intimacy is one of the greatest strengths as a scholar, I would say. The emotional, affective sensitivity of her writing has drawn me in for many years. Over 30 years that I have been lucky enough to be entangled with Giuliana's practice. She has drawn me in as a participant, as an artist, and the subject of her curiosity, her lust of eyes. I first met Giuliana, I would say, through her writing in the 1980s and 90s. I was involved as a reader and board member of the Screen magazine, where my husband, Mark Nash, had been an editor, which was a publication responsible for introducing things like psychoanalytic theory to the discipline of cinema studies. And because of my work with Screen, I was invited a few years later with my partner, NYU Cinema Studies program, by the late Annette Michelson. And it was Annette who ultimately introduced me to Giuliana herself. However, I did not really have the opportunity to get to know her well until Skip Gates invited me here to Harvard with Mark to teach in VES, then known by some as Very Easy Studies. But not to the students of Giuliana, and dare I say, myself, when I taught her. And at that time, I was introduced to her wonderful husband, Andy Feinberg, who rescued me twice, not once, but twice, on my films, Baltimore, and once again, Statues Never Die. So you can see how the encounter becomes entangled. There are many individual strands to my entanglement with Giuliana. Although her practice draws on very different traditions and are enacted through very different media, we have the wonderful habit, I think, of asking similar questions about the archive and about memory, and about the institutions that define the limits of the archive and regulate the production of historical memory. I'm speaking, of course, first and foremost about the museum and architecture which invites a viewer into an archive and a habit of seeing. This process, the process of physically entering into and then navigating an archive, necessitates a movement. Our experience of architecture is really our experience of moving through the architectural space. Like in a film installation, we should have known as soon as Street Walking on a Ruined Map was published that Giuliana would become a force of nature when it came to diagramming and describing relationship between memory and movement. If you can manage not only to navigate, but then write about navigating a city like Naples, with which, of course, Walter Benjamin thought of as an impossibly complicated web of buildings and actions, then you can do anything. We know this as well, as Juliana and Andy and Mark and I have met for over the last 25 years in that city and its surrounding areas. Many of the artworks move the viewer through the museum spaces. Perhaps one can trace my entanglement with Juliana back to a pair of these works, Vagabondia 2000 and Baltimore 2003, which Juliana has written about in several essays. Here is from the Riot book, which we did for Museum of Modern Art in 2010, and several essays. And of course, Andy had produced several of the films. Her essays on these works include The Architect's Museum from her landmark book, Surface, and Museums and Moving Image from my own artistic autobiography, Riot, which I did for MoMA. And at the very beginning of Surface, Juliana explains that the screen, the, quote, surface of the screen canvas, end of quote, is also in itself an archive. Filmmakers and moving image artists in orchestrating a play of images to be produced onto the screen and assuming a role of an archivist. With the museum created, therefore, we shared responsibility for fabricating the visual theatrical architecture of spectatorship. That is the space that the viewer will inhabit and the device that activates the space as archive for the viewer. For more than 3 decades, beginning with The Attendant in 1983, my work has been invested in uncovering how the museum's architecture of spectatorship fundamentally operates as a principle of exclusion, seclusion, and, I say, seduction, not just for the exclusion of certain visitors along the axis that we're familiar with, but also with the exclusion and seclusion of certain narratives and perspectives that would foster a sense of ambivalence in the visitor. That is to say that the museum offers a visitor a very selective presentation, projection of a visual archive. The visitor, as spectator, moves through the space and experiences the archive as a succession of objects, activated and connected to one another by the visitor's movement through the space, and these objects from an archival narrative are pocores because the modern museum's architecture of spectatorship is also very explicitly an architecture of power. The viewer then receives this narrative, these stories about the past, as though they are durable, inedible social memory. What then happens when the museum's architecture spectatorship becomes entangled with the cinematic architecture of spectatorship? Juliana asks, since making Vagabondia, I would say this is a central question in some of Juliana's works. And since making Vagabondia and Baltimore, I've explored, and Juliana has written about, how the structural qualities of a multiple-screen moving image work can destabilize and problematize the museum's position as the arbiter of social memory. In Vagabondia, a double-screen installation which I made, this process plays out according to what I call the creolization of vision. The film is set in the Sir John Soane Museum in London, the House Museum of an Architect. Sir John Soane, his rabid collection practice, quickly filled every surface of the space with an overwhelming array of objects, artifacts gathered from around the world. And as I've said elsewhere, in this kind of 40s-centric globalization of his museum, one can feel how the Blighty Island, which I was born in, a precursor for a certain kind of modern globalization efforts, have, as it were, secured its place. The film represents multiple temporal planes. One is the contemporary, where the conservator, character played by the fabulous late Cleo Sylvester, who sadly passed away last month, speaks to herself in Creole. And the second is a psychic time, which we understand to be a projected sort of memory from herself. As the conservator speaks, she is remembering an 18th century past in which Sir John Soane, played by my husband, Professor Nash, who walks through the house alongside two black women. And in the third temporal plane, a trickster character, a kind of modern vagabond, dances through the museum. In surface, Juliana describes these movements as detours through the museum space, which retrace the steps of social memory, and in doing suggest a visionary history in motion, a way of being thrust forward by looking backward with different eyes, which of course I like. One of Juliana's many majestic strengths as a scholar is the way in which she sees. Her eyes never rest. She always is seeing double, triple, or more. The microscopic lens and the telephoto lens sweeps across the history of film without resting. Only this way could one manage to see so many layers in a surface that Juliana inspects and doesn't just bear an image, but an image of a projection, and a projection as a product of a particular projecting apparatus, and a projecting apparatus situated within a particular history of viewing technology and a modern viewing of history technology that is explicitly linked with the modern social formation of visibility as a concept itself. I could go on. I mean, Juliana has an astounding ability to identify, articulate the way in which artworks gain a social function, and how can it meditate or even generate in a viewer memories of a social past beyond an author's intention. The gift of a scholar like Juliana is not merely to describe a work, but to bring hidden nuances to its workings, to eliminate themes beyond its own articulation. Perhaps there's something very Neapolitan about this, I would say. Reading Juliana's writings is like walking or moving through Naples, Capri, or the Sorrento Peninsula, which my partner and I have had the pleasure to do with her over the years. One follows Juliana through a text, through these vast shifting landscapes of memory, and feels very grateful to a certain gracious and exciting guide, I must say. And at times the landscape even feels like it might lift itself off the page, like a filmscape. One sense of motion in relationship to words and images that Juliana creates nothing less than a zoetropic effect. The structural qualities of her writing mirrors the filmic structures that she has identified within her writing. This is, of course, another kind of entanglement, an entanglement between Juliana, her subject, and the reader. In 2019, I tried my hand at tracing a new marvelous entanglement with the work of Lina Barbardi. In some ways, it was inevitable that Juliana would be part of this. As luck would have it, Juliana and Andy were able to be my eyes in Rome as part of a cohort of visitors who attended the opening of the 9-screen premiere of the work in Italy at the Maxi Museum during the pandemic, an occasion that I had fantasized about and had hoped to attend, as Rome was Lina Barbardi's birthplace, but of course that didn't happen. So, Juliana, I'm so grateful that you and Andy went. When making Lina Barbardi a marvelous entanglement, I was interested in how nonlinear narrative structure could further introduce a temporal entanglement, which is the reason why we decided to cast the actresses of different ages portraying Lina Barbardi, Fernanda Montenegro, the grand dame of Brazilian cinema, and the art, and Fernanda Torres, her daughter, who stars actually in the new Walter Salas film, which is great, you have to see it. That way, the relationship between the past and the present created a layered temporal experience for the spectator entering the exhibition. So I will now play from the work, which is of course a single screen, so it's a little bit linear, as most trailers are, so you get an idea of the work. So if we could have that trailer, thank you. So, moving forward, January 2025, I'm incredibly excited to announce that you have the opportunity to read Giuliana Bruno's incredible essay in a new publication which we kind of created for her on the Linda Barbaldi project, which will be published by Yale Centre for British Art. And Giuliana's essay, which has this amazing title, Breathing the Air of Rationality, is an extraordinary piece, a masterful discourse of the interplay between art and architecture and relationality. In her text, Juliana's entanglements are a remarkably complex space that can be more an interaction, evoking Karen Brown's notion of interaction, which intertwines agencies that form a dynamic web of relationships and create a potential for transformative change. Linda Barbaldi's architecture, with its openness to social, environmental, and cultural intersections, emerges as a built environment for this idea. Her work is an entanglement of modernist sensibilities with Brazilian cultural and environmental context. In Juliana's words, quote, an entanglement becomes a feast of hybridities, an inventive mesh in which unfixed things could mix and transform, end of quote. Barbaldi's projects such as Theatre Officina, Seschi Pompeia, Maspi, the restaurant Quati in Salvador, Casa de Vidro, her beautiful glass house in São Paulo, prioritize the openness of environmental integration and community engagement. They broke down the barriers between the natural and built environment, exemplifying what Juliana calls an architecture of weather. Juliana writes, Barbaldi's architecture of weather communicates the transitive capacities of air as a moving, connective social tissue. Later she adds that Barbaldi's architecture of weather, with its airy biomorphic openings, created a modern habitat as it activated environmental transformation that was both artistic, cultural, and social. Her buildings often rejected Western conventions, such as, well, the conventions of air conditioning, which of course she hated, solid enclosures, which she detested, favoring a more dynamic interaction between people and their surroundings. I thought, to some extent, my architectural thinking when creating installations sometimes is somewhat similar. I work towards creating spaces of spectatorship that are simultaneously open and immersive. This extends to the formal qualities of the work itself, for instance, with the camera movements that we use while filming, the fluidity of the shot, adding techniques reflects the poetics of architectural openness which Lina Bardi created. Her open plan design that eliminates, if you like, vanishes walls and place artworks on crystal glass easels at the São Paulo Museum of Art, MASP, revolutionized the way art is displayed and experienced, and it nourished the non-linear relational viewing experiences, allowing visitors to move freely around the artworks and engage with them in associative manners. Lina Bardi's philosophy, in a sense, draws from the plant biology which Giuliana evokes in her essay's title, symbolizing the architect's adaptability to new environments. These roots, like her architecture, grow in the air and draw their nourishment from their environments, while fostering interactions with surrounding elements. Giuliana writes that Bardi, quote, related formation of her creolized cultural roots for her with the experience of uprooting and rerouting sympathetically evokes how particular plants develop their own roots, plants that have a root structure that is so deeply sensitive to the atmosphere and to atmospheric, changes so much that they are sometimes called air plants, and that their roots form an organism that grows in the air on the surface of other plants while implanted within. Rereading Giuliana's reflections here, I'm once again admiring how insightful and creative and innovative her thinking and writing is, especially how striking and different the beautiful approach to the concept of rootedness. Her discussion of rootedness necessarily brings out Eduardo Glissant's Poetics of Relation and her concept of rootedness, which Juliana then connects to my own work, as Glissant theorized the emergence of a new cartography by rethinking the Caribbean reality in a way that only resonates with my own creolized vision, but with Bardi's own hybridized architecture of nonlinearity. Glissant, in a sense, identified how one sense of identity develops through a relationship with the other, and the state of rootedness, if you like, is therefore the state that arises from the entanglement with, rather than a kind of abandonment of relationship. So I guess in many ways I still feel drawn to this concept in my own thinking when making the work, and I think in a way that Giuliana, in her astonishing essay on the Bardi, in a way really gives us this highly internalized architectural space, which in a sense manipulates the atmosphere and therefore gives us this particular response, where she says that the museum's aim is to create an atmosphere, a demeanor capable of evoking for the visitor's state of mind. I'd like to finish by pairing these words from Lina Bardi with Giuliana's latest exquisite thought on museum, where she writes, quote, "The museum itself is an organism in motion. Like a life form, it contains enfoldments of the past and present. Entangled in its cultural architecture, the museal display is not a static form that one can, as it were, progress non-linearly, but in time and space, if it is as it follows and reinvents the experimental design that Bardi pioneered, which might be called a curatorial ecology," end of quote. I suggest now that we watch an excerpt from Lina Bardi and Marvel's Entanglement, which was from the staircase of the Massey Museum, in which the voices of one woman are intertwined as they perform identical lines from Bardi's text in What is a Museum? This is the free screen version. It is a 9-screen in its original format.
Tá tudo pronto? Tá? Vou falar. Continuar a terceira, câmera A. 1:31, primeira, câmera A. Casas ou museus?
Primeiro as casas ou os
Tudo
museus?
de uma vez só. As casas,
Tudo de uma só
as
vez?
escolas, os
As
museus,
casas, as
as
escolas, os
bibliotecas.
museus, as bibliotecas.
A planificação de
A
uma
planificação
cidade
de
não
uma
pode
cidade
esquecer
não
dois
pode
edifícios
esquecer dois
públicos,
edifícios públicos
que ainda hoje são considerados um luxo intelectual.
O
O museu e a biblioteca. Museu? Ó,
O museu.
o que é um museu?
O que é um museu?
Correntemente,
Correntemente,
quando se quer designar uma pessoa, uma coisa, uma ideia antiquada, inútil, fora de uso,
Costuma-se dizer, é uma peça de museu.
costuma-se dizer, é uma peça de museu.
Querendo indicar com essas palavras o lugar
essas
que
palavras,
no quadro da
o
cultura
lugar
contemporânea
que
o
no
museu
quadro da
ocupa.
cultura contemporânea,
Lugar
o museu.
poerento e inútil.
Lugar poerento e inútil.
O
O museu moderno tem que ser um museu didático. Tem que juntar
Ele tem que juntar a conservação,
a capacidade de transmitir a mensagem que as obras devem ser postas em evidência por parte do arquiteto,
que não deve aproveitar a ocasião para dar espetáculo em torno de si mesmo.
Fato. Qual a significação de uma peça isolada?
Uma obra de arte mesmo, se exposta
assim
com a mais perfeita
a mais
técnica
perfeita
museográfica.
técnica
Se
museográfica.
essa obra é fim em si mesma,
Se esta obra
isolada no tempo,
é
no espaço,
fim em si
sem nenhuma
mesma,
ligação com o nosso,
isolada no tempo e no
sem
espaço,
continuidade histórica,
sem nenhuma ligação com o nosso tempo, sem continuidade histórica. Falei.
In Juliana's in Juliana's essay, she describes entanglement as the marvelous interconnection between the architect Lina Rabadi and myself, the artist. I hope it's obvious by now that there's actually a third party missing from this description. Really, it's a marvelous interconnection between the architect, the artist, and the legendary scholar and theorist of the moving image, Juliana. Thank you for your attention. And thank you, Juliana, for your extraordinary work throughout the years. It has been wonderful to go on these walks and detours with you.
Sorry, I have to do a couple of manipulation. Okay. So it's not easy to talk about Giuliana Bruno's work. From a strictly philological point of view, her books don't belong properly or not just to artistry. They are sort of multiple volumes treatise about a new science that could be called speculative pyrotechnics. So this is a suggestion for your collected works with some subtitles like How do fireworks with ideas, or Why ideas are fireworks. More than just books, Bruno's works are devices that allow ideas to explode in order each time to change the form of sensitive reality, to give another light and other colors to the world. And it's hard, going through them again, not to feel out of breath, not for lack, but for excess of oxygen and light. It's like attending a kind of rave party of ideas, or rather a party where ideas themselves are in a state of lethargic intoxication. They see more than we can see. And this is not an opinion. Isaac, already spoke, but there is a huge list of artists who have been inspired by their work, who are the fireworks of their work, of her work. And it's not usual for artists to be inspired by art theorists. Actually, usually it's the opposite. So now in front of this landscape, in order to avoid a bad hangover or an overdose, I would like to try to present just one of the ideas developed in her books, which seems to be important and urgent because it has changed the meaning of what we call artistry, art practice, and therefore also the curatorial museum. Giuliana's work allowed me to call her by her first name as a sign of friendship and admiration, but also to avoid to confuse her with an equally famous compatriot of hers who lived 4 centuries ago, but he has a different name, Giordano. So Giuliana's work is the foundation of a new concept of spatiality that she calls Atlas. So the Atlas emerges strongly and appears in the title of what is considered by many, with good reasons, Giuliana's magnus opus, The Atlas of Emotion. This book is an investigation into the formal, material, and speculative genealogy of what we call cinema. The research is together historical, archival, and theoretical, but for ease of time, I will limit myself here to the speculative data. So the brilliant insight is that contrary to what has been believed and written about for decades, cinema, and by an easy syllogism, one could say modern art in general, is not the child of Renaissance perspective and the child of the splendid isolation of vision from other senses that it produced. From this point of view, actually, the Atlas of Emotion is a kind of anti-Panofsky book, so it's a sort of anti-die Perspektive als symbolische Form, and it's actually no coincidence that in her last book, in Atmosphere of Projection, Juliana is proposing an alternative genealogy of the pictorial gesture. So, as you know, according to Panofsky, modern painting as perspective painting coincides with the effort to transform the psychophysiological space into mathematical space. I'm quoting Panofsky. So, Panofsky has defined perspective as this technique through which, I'm quoting him again, different objects with a part of the space in which they are located. Different objects with a part of the space in which they are located in such a way that the idea of the material support of the picture is completely supplanted by the idea of a transparent plane through which we believe we overlook an imaginary space that includes all objects in an apparent succession and is not limited by the edges of the picture but only cropped out, end of quote. In this way, the canvas, and thus the work of art, acquires objective spatial depth, absorbs all outer space, and visually concentrates it on its surface in an objective manner. Every perspective painting thus gives the feeling of exteriority and arbitrariness to the viewer. According to Giuliana, cinema is actually the symbolic form and technology in which all exactly opposite efforts converge. That is, those that tend to converge all mathematical and geometrical space into psychophysiological space. Cinema is that device of projection which produces a temporary coincidence between inner spatiality and outer space, between psychism and matter. And the book shows that it's not an original and 19th century invention, nor a result of a technical device. It's more similar to what Riegel would have called a Kunstwollen that has haunted European art since centuries. Therefore, it must be regarded as the ultimate manifestation of an anthropological and cosmological project involving two steps together, technical and metaphysical. The first is the active construction of a perfect permeability of psychic interiority and physical exteriority. There's a sort of perfect equivalence between the psychological, the soul, and the matter. This technology, Giuliana shows, is actually both ancestral and ubiquitous. Whether Madame de Scudéry map, physiognomy, or georama, these were devices that, in Giuliana's words, must, I'm quoting her, perform an imaginary inversion and in so doing establish a pre-filmic route as the world was turned outside in, exteriors was made into interior. So it's a specific topology of space, which is expressing itself within cinema. In short, cinema is the expression and embodiment of this new topology, of this new speciality, which is totally different from the physical concept invented in the 17th century, but also from the concept of speciality theorized since the Einsteinian revolution. And this is already something, from a point of view of a history of ideas, extremely important because, I mean, cinema is this, what Juliana calls this atlas is actually the modern space, the modern space par excellence, and that means that actually, sorry, I skipped. That means that actually, what we have called Western modernity is actually a multi-phase reality, not only linked to science, industry or economics, as a terrible anthropological and political vulgate continues to preach, very naive and crude from an ethnographic point of view. Actually, there is another kind of Western modernity which has been produced by art and which has brought it over and that has nothing to do with or only accidentally with production, domination, and whatever, nor with the measurement of the globe. It is this space that Juliana baptized with the name of Atlas. And this baptism is perhaps her most radical and brilliant philosophical gesture. So modernity is the modernity of Atlas, which is the gesture by which actually the space is full of emotion, feelings, images, memories, and so on. And this is the invention of modernity. I mean, I'm quoting Juliana. So, an atlas is actually a space which is different in quantity and quality from those theorized by physics. There is, first of all, a quantitative difference. Indeed, this space opened up actually indefinitely. Pre-cinematographic devices and then cinema, I'm quoting Juliana, are permeable systems of opening and closing, a type of space that refers to other space and ultimately to every space, end of quote. It is an anti-geometric space and a space beyond measure because not only is any rectangle or figure capable of accommodating infinite other spaces, but vice versa, the infinite is always included in a real specific place. So in the screen of the cinema, every space is included. It's an intensive and non-extensive infinity. The space is immense, but this immensity is not generated through the addition or the juxtaposition of other spaces. Everything is included in everything, and every space is related virtually to any other space, no matter whether present or past, no matter whether real or imaginary. So it's really huge, this the space of Atlas. From this point of view, the infinity of the Atlas is much larger than that of modern or Einsteinian physics. This is why space no longer has any metric or geometrical determination. It's not the equivalent or metric representation of real space, it's the inherent force of all spaces, their capacity of transformation transformation for nonlinear and non-geometric metamorphosis. It's a supreme form of cosmic fluidity. And precisely because of it, it's a fluid reality, because if it's a fluid reality, constantly in the act of passing itself from one space to another, in this space, seeing and traveling coincide. In Giuliana's words, I'm quoting her, the motion pictures does precisely what its name announces, like Scudery's map. It is the very synthesis of seeing and going a place where seeing is going. End of quote. Perceiving and traveling coincide in the sense that just looking is enough to move. And that's also why every place in this space is potentially infinite. Now, the Atlas is a different space not only in quantity, but also and especially in quality, and for at least 3 reasons. The first is aesthetic in nature. There, where sensation and space, where feelings and matter coincide, all vision is also an act, all vision is also action, and vice versa. This is why the separation of the senses, the division of the senses and the privileging of the visible toward other senses comes to an end. This is also what it is no coincidence, that as Juliana writes, I'm quoting her, cinema emerged alongside a reformulation of spatiality in art theory proposed most notably by Alois Riegel, who developed the notion of the haptic, end of quote. And as Anthony Widler noted in his preface to Public Intimacy, this affirmation of the unity of seeing and touch goes against all the modern tradition, represented by Lessing, for instance, that stressed actually the separation of the senses. And this is very important. When Lessing divided the senses or theorized the autonomy of each senses of the human being, was also theorizing the autonomy of each medium. So that's why Giuliana's project is also claiming the unity of all arts. It's not just about cinema. It's putting together all senses means to put together again all forms of art. Secondly, cinematic space is not the Albertist window. It is, I'm quoting her, a window through which the interior perspired outwardly, made itself present, semiotically manifest, even historical, readable. The interior mapped itself tangibly. End of quote. Therefore, not only there is no longer any corporeal boundary between inside and outside, but also the boundary between subject and objects becomes porous, precisely because it is generated by projection, which causes, I'm quoting her, the exterior world of the landscape has become transformed into an interior landscape. End of quote. Cinema is the fusion of psychology and physics. In a way, if you think about that, watching each film means that we have this strange experience of topological inversion between reality and consciousness. In the space in front of you, we have to see the dream, in the space in front of us, we give to see the dream, an undivided core of stories, affects, feelings, emotions, memories, imaginations. The most intimate becomes objective fact, and objectivity is made out of the matter, which is the most intimate and sentimental, psychological in us. So this chiasm produces 2 capital differences. Because of cinema, space ceases to be empty, like physics claimed, and it becomes a very dense space full of, memories, feelings, and so on. And the second and most important quality of Atlas space is that inversely to Einsteinian space, the matter of space is now time. Because if if space is full of interiority, then like Augustine used to say, interiority is just pure time. So there is this contradiction of a space which is made just out of time, which is a good definition of cinema, actually. So now, why call this space an atlas? This was for me like the most interesting problem. I mean, it was not, of course, it was not just Juliana. There is a huge tradition, but why? So beyond the suggestion provided by Scudery and the thousands of other examples that Juliana piles up in the pages of this full-bodied book, there is perhaps a deeper metaphysical reasons. And in order to understand that, I invite you to think of Google Map and to this very special gesture that you are doing, taking yourself as a little man and then throwing itself into the maps. So, every atlas is a very peculiar form of image, one that actually serves not to represent reality, but to make reality inhabitable. It's a huge difference. And every atlas is also a paradoxical image because it's the opposite of contemplation. It's very interesting. It makes no sense to contemplate an atlas. It's like a different attitude. It's the opposite of contemplation, which normally radically separates object and subjects. To use a map means each time to identify with what you're looking at. It's exactly this gesture. You have to recognize yourself as a portion of what you're seeing. And this is exactly what you're doing when you're smashing the little boy into the atlas. You are like producing the unity between a subject and object. Very clever way of representing the process of reading an atlas. So in order to make any map image intelligible, we must think of our body as coincident with the lines and the colors we see, and then return to interpreting what we see out of the image in our experience from the point of view of the image. That is what is interesting. In order to use an atlas, you have to look at the atlas, then identify yourself in the atlas, and then you have to look back at your experience, but from the point of view of the atlas. So you become like this very strange oscillation between object and subject. A map is an image that becomes a subject and interprets the real and does not represent it. The image must produce this alchemy, produce at least for a moment the identity of status between the perceiving subject and the perceived object. In this inversion, where the image sees the world, each atlas makes the image the subject looking at the world and not a copy of it. Indeed, it's only when we have assimilated our identity to what is seen, the use of the map becomes possible. From this identification, our spatial and temporal experience becomes intelligible again. In this inversion, however, actually there is a possible opening which is like played out, and this like opening is not perhaps visible in normal cartographical maps. That's why, in order to understand better how an atlas works, I propose you also to look at another kind of atlas, which are tarots. Don't take it as a provocation. I'm doing philology in this case. So, tarot cards. So, in tarots, we are dealing with a cartography of time. That's why it's interesting. And not of space. We use tarot cards to be able to interpret our future, a mobile and subjective element in itself, animated already coinciding with the subject's life. Unlike the calendar, in which time is measured and defined as empty, tarot transforms time into a dimension in which not only does the distinction between past and present and future have a purely graphic and no longer substantive consistency, but life is as autonomous with respect to the subject itself that represents it. Through the image of the tarot, time exists in front of us as something that has the same status as ourselves. That's why it's so interesting. The future and the past possess the same freedom that we attribute to ourselves, and that's why the relationship we can have with it is only the relationship of an interpretation. We have to interpret tarots for the same reason that we cannot know ourselves. We have always to interpret ourselves. So tarot are spaces in which the image makes the real something inseparable from desire. And unlike the will, desire is something that imposes on existence a relationship defined by mystery and ignorance. Desire is always something we ignore, and we can only divine. It is this moment that the world makes within us, installing itself in it and altering everything it encounters. Now, the problem that Giuliana's work is like formulating is, what does it mean to live in a world that has become an atlas? Because this is like the conclusion of the book of Juliana. It's that cinema transformed reality in a huge atlas. The question may seem idle, and in part it is the case, ever since actually Eric Johnson, a famous researcher at the Royal Radar Establishment in Malvern, England, published a now famous article in 1967 on touch display programmed man-machine interface. That was the first article that spoke about touchscreen. That space that Juliana baptized as Atlas has become the global form of our experience. The smartphone, actually, is not just a mere evolution of a phone. It's a device that transforms our entire experience into an atlas. Because of that, we are living within the atlas, actually. Thanks to it, if you think about that, one place contains all others. And all other spaces are connected emotionally and not physically. This is exactly what Juliana meant, actually. Thanks to it, vision and contact coincide. Thanks to it, perceiving coincides with a form of movement. So it's really, it was a description of the smartphone that came a little bit later. Space coincides with its legibility, its representation, and thus with its infinite extensibility. In its most radical form, this is what happened also with smart glasses. Through them, we now not only live in the atlas. If you think about it, smart glasses are amazing. We are living literally within the atlas, and the experience of the atlas is the condition of possibility of the perception of reality. And vice versa, everything becomes atlas for us, even ourselves. That's the most interesting point. We are atlases within the atlas. So the first mistake to avoid now is to think that in this new planetary atlas, actually we don't need any more orientation. So that the first mistake would be to think that living in the atlas means always knowing where you are and what we are. It's the opposite, actually, because if you are an atlas in the atlas, nobody knows nothing, actually. And that's our condition, actually. This pervasiveness of the atlas, the substitution of the ancient res extensa for space that is perception and emotion in action, means constant disorientation. It is as if the world has changed matter, and it's precisely why everything is again to be studied and plotted and designed. So, however, there are a couple of ideas that Giuliana works triggered and also expressed. One was given by Giuliana herself, by her practice, and the other one has given by an artist who was explicitly inspired by Giuliana's work, another artist, Isaac, but I'm speaking about another artist. One is a reflection on what it means to think within the atlas, and the other one is what does it mean to have a body? And more generally, what does it mean to have a gender within the atlas? So I will conclude just with two short examples. The first is actually coming from fashion. So in September 2015, Alessandro Michele, who had been hired as Coccia's creative director a few months earlier, presented a collection called Carte d'étendre, which is, to my opinion, the best essays written on Giuliana's book, actually. So the press release which was presenting it, which is a kind of philosophical treatise, as Alessandro Michele used to do for each of his collection, mixes references to the Situationist, to Dérivé, and to Madeleine de Scudéry, of course, and ends with the quotation of Giuliana Bruno. There you could think that it's Giordano, no, actually it's Giuliana. So the idea is that the dress should be represented as a psychogeographical drift capable of recording the urban unconscious. I'm quoting Alessandro, maps that embroider the world within a discourse of affectionate intimacy. It's very Brunian. End of quote. This is not an abstract reference, actually. The fourth dress of the collection, you see that there, is constructed from a fabric on which Clély's carte d'étendre is printed. Now, what does this gesture mean? If we live in the atlas, if we are atlases within an atlas, what does our body become? Alessandro Michele's collection is actually an answer to this question. It's like showing us we are atlas within the atlas. But what does it mean to become an atlas? It's a very strange feeling, actually. For if a body becomes an atlas, it's the idea of gender that is transformed. This is a very beautiful idea, actually. Because of the battles which were necessary to stop this long and bloody war of one gender over all others that has been called patriarchy, we have become accustomed to considering genders as identities, even if constructed, however, identities. Michele's proposal is quite different. Gender actually is not an identity, it's a map. Very beautiful idea. It's an atlas to find the way through tenderness. Now, to have a gender body means to have a body that can allow other bodies, first of all, to identify. You remember this idea of to read an atlas means to identify yourself in the atlas, which means, by the way, that if you consider the body as an atlas, you have to consider that the first contact to another person is homoerotic in a way. So that was also the explicit idea. But so means to have a body that can allow other bodies to identify with your bodies, to observe themselves from your point of view, and then to better understand through this identification their own position, and thus to navigate in their own experience. To have a gender then means not to possess a different body from others, but to be a compass to each other. To be able to become the image through which bodies recognize themselves as different from what they are. The most important thing, after all, is this, actually. It is always the body of the other that makes our experience understandable and livable, exactly like it is the atlas that makes our life understandable. It's this relationship of opening the self through the other that we call tenderness, and dress and fashion from this point of view becomes what allows each of us to take a journey into our emotion and those of others. To wear a dress means to open yourself to bodies, to other bodies, to enter into the lives of others and into your own life. Now, and I will conclude, I promise, how do an atlas think? If the atlas is the space where there is no distinction between matter and psychology, it's clear that the privileged form of atlas thinking is the exhibition. It's not an accident. It's no accident that Giuliana had to become. It was a destiny, actually, to become a curator, and indeed conceived writing itself as a supplementary form of museographic curatorship. Her books are virtual catalogs of exhibitions whose museums has not been yet built, actually. So we have to build each museum for each book of Juliana. So writing, writes Juliana, like cartography, isn't transport. It has always been a form of mapping for me and a material charting. Now, to understand why thinking and writing in the atlas means making exhibition, let me trace back to a gesture that could be defined as the paradigm of exhibition making. Plutarch and other ancient sources related Romulus, so the famous guy who founded Rome, before founding the city, opened a circular pit to deposit the beginnings of what is good, of everything what is good by law and necessary by nature. So a collection of the best things in the world. It's from the name of this ritual space that the term word in Latin come, which word in Latin is mundus, and this gesture and this collection of the best things in the world were called mundus. In a way, every exhibition is a repetition of this ancestral gesture. It's an exercise of cosmogonic improvisation. It's the place where an ephemeral collection of things becomes the word. Each exhibition is a theory of the word, but one that uses the word in itself to represent it. Similarly, Giuliana, rather than merely theorizing art, uses art to make it intelligible and helps us to orient ourselves within this space. Just as in cinematic space, in the exhibition, a portion of the world condenses into itself, miniaturizes and represents the entire cosmos, that because of this allows us to understand it, to orient ourselves within it. It's as if the image claims to coincide materially and formally with what it designates. Each exhibition transforms reality itself into an atlas, a space-time in which objects acquire unprecedented power. A portion of the real does not merely manifest itself, but exposes something else, the world in its totality. The objects on display, the object described by Giuliana, transform the space-time of the exhibition into an act of reflection of the world on itself. It's a strange exercise of controlled animism. The objects gathered before the viewer become a kind of collected shared spirit that speaks to the viewer. Each small portion of matter begins to speak. The self merges within the things themselves. This is the thrill of living in the Atlas, and Giuliana's work is an invitation and a guide to open what someone else would have called the doors of perception. Thank you.
Well, thank you for these extraordinary presentations. I would like now to invite both speakers, Isaac and Emanuele, and of course Giuliana, to join me at the podium. It's a deep pleasure for me to have been asked to moderate this discussion. I am connected to, not to say entangled, with Giuliana through a very, very long, we don't want to say how many years, it's depressing, and very deep, deep friendship that started here actually at Harvard. For both of us, it was, for me at least, it was a first job, and yours probably too. So we go back way back, right. But what I have to say is, in the course of these interactions, one of the things that I notice about Giuliana's scholarship, which is of course essential for our friendship, it's a platform of exchange and a kind of enrichment for both of us. But it's the deep pleasure that one takes in it. I remember this one time when I was coming back from a lecture at GSD, which I liked very much, and I was going home in the evening and thinking about all these ideas that were tossed around, and I suddenly noticed that I was just, deeply happy. It's just what your way of thinking, your way of arguing is not just food for thought, but it is really kind of working on the emotional level, which is amazing. I was skipping home, basically. So, I do have to say that there's also a strong element of pleasure in my relation to the work of Isaac and Emanuele. I have to say that I spent an entire day at Tate Britain, and without planning it, at your fantastic retrospective. I was thinking that I will do 3 exhibitions before catching my flight, and I just began with Isaac, and that was it. It was just amazingly rewarding, I really thank you for that aesthetic experience. Emanuele, your lectures are always so surprising and so rewarding, including the fashion that's involved in the presentation. So this is really a great situation. Okay, I thought that this was, as you probably will agree, an extraordinarily consonant ensemble, the 2 speakers and you, Giuliana. There were so many rich intersections that we are reminded of and that resurfaced here. So I would like, before, of course, turning the discussion to the audience, I would like to ask you a couple of questions that would involve issues that are important, I think, to all 3 of you, and I wanted for you to have a kind of trialogue, right? So first, the centrality of the notion of relatedness and relation for all 3 of you in different ways. Giuliana, one thinks, of course, from the very beginning, the way in which you radically rethought the relation between the viewer and the image, away from the semiotic models or the models of identification, and as Emanuele described it, a sort of a trajectory towards the atlas in which you see yourself from within the image, as it were. For Isaac, the way in which you have reinvented the mode, the particular genre in contemporary art, that of installation, in order to create a space of dialogic experience, an experience of relatedness, right? And for Emanuele, the whole, ecology of relatedness that you have created, in which, by expanding the question of relation, as epitomized by your statement, to live is to live in and through the life of others, where life is understood not only as the life of humans, but but the life of plants, right? So, how do you see the importance of the idea of relation and relatedness, each of you, in your work? And how important do you think it is now, right now, actually? Let's begin with Giuliana.
Okay. Well, first of all, speaking of relation and relatedness, I would love to be able to thank everyone for their amazing relational contribution to this event, and the two of you, and Sarah and Eva and and Laura and Joanna and Emilio and Samira, everybody who organized this. I can't possibly mention you all. Sharon did for me, and it was really today for me a real sense of tangible relatedness, and how powerful relatedness could be, not just as connections between disciplines, which is something that is very important to my work, but also how, in a way, it's a form of planned thinking, like how you seed something that sprouts, and that roots sprout and they connect to each other like mushrooms that are able to, underneath, form relations that connect themselves and communicate across. And I felt all day today that that's what was happening. This morning, the panels, this afternoon's panels, presented, strangely enough, some of the themes that both of you today came back with, including the idea of the marvelous entanglement and senti pensare and all kinds of forms of relation and relatedness that appear this afternoon. So thank to all the former and current students also for what they did, which actually expressed more than I could how important this idea of sprouting and entanglements really is. So yes, relation. It's sort of central. There were many things that you both brought up today that connect us. The last of the eyes and critical intimacy, notions of entanglements, and yes, why not pyrotechnics of relations, meaning going beyond an idea of interdisciplinarity into finding knots and spaces that generate different kinds of relation as forms of transformation, points of connections that can exist in between, that exist in the void, that exist in spaces where you least imagine they are, and that can project forms of transformation. And one of the ideas that Isaac, you brought out that I very much connect to is this notion of then how does a relation becomes an entanglement, and not to be afraid of that idea, not to be afraid of being entangled with an object, with an artist, with a person, because that it means actually a form of closeness as well. So it goes beyond even the sense of a kind of horizontal relationality, but something that actually also means getting into the atlas, getting inside the space and being able to, from within that, try to generate something else. And that's, to my mind, I'm delighted, and I couldn't, not even begin to thank you and repeat what you have said, and I'm really humbled by it, but I really feel it very deeply as something that has moved me, and one could call it critical intimacy. There's a way in which this idea of connections that are made in motion and in transformation that create emotion is also a deep form of that goes well beyond identification or identity. Emanuele, you're completely right, but it's like attempting to somehow also embody some of these forms and being able to also express yourself to it. And so that's what my greatest pleasure has been teaching in a department like this that are artists, and you were one of the ones who taught, and many of the others. So being able to actually try to get close to that process, the process of making, the practice of putting things together, which is, in a sense, a curatorial practice, is a form of exhibition in the best of all possible ways, because that's what you would do, and that's what Lina Bobardi does, and you showed it really beautifully in this particular image in which you see that these objects are never isolated, that you never see in isolation. That's Bobardi's work that you repeated, where there is no sense of it's only the connections and the way the connections are being made in the motion, like in her museum, in your beautiful piece, where you constantly move, not just this way, but back and forth and around, and create this kind of your own entanglement with the work. And so that's the idea of the marvelous entanglement is also important in terms of this form of relationality, because it's, as Bobardi put it, the temporality is the notion that temporality is linear is a Western invention, because the time is a marvelous entanglement. And what she means by it is that at any points connection can be made and detours can happen. So it's not like being entrapped. It's the form of relation that actually allows you to breathe. And that's why in the piece that I wrote for you, I insisted on this idea of the which goes back, Emanuele, to your work and to your understanding of atmosphere as a form of relationality, or atmosphere as an atlas, as a place in which the world comes together in connections rather than necessarily in division, because she speaks about this idea of the epiphytic roots. The epiphytes are plants that have roots in the air. And so they take their energy from the atmosphere, literally, an atmosphere that connects us all together, despite all our divisions or our differences. And they are actually nurtured by the air, by the rain, by what happens around them. And what happens is that they sprout their roots in this particular direction. So, as you were saying, it's a different form of rootedness. It's also understanding rootedness as something that is less static, less about identity, as you were saying, but more about, in a different way, about being able to actually participate, transform, change, being in the world in that particular way. And so that, for me, is being really like a trajectory that started perhaps long ago, and that formed itself through different kinds of thinking and different kinds of works. And sometimes, and Sarah, since you so wonderfully retold this story, then I have to reciprocate in relationality. There was one time I gave a talk at the GSD, which often hosted me in the large auditorium, and it was the beginning of my thinking about surface and about pleats and folds, and which involved another fashion thing, Ise Miyake, obviously, in relation to Deleuze, which was some kind of thing I was doing. And you came up to me and said, I don't exactly know what you're doing, but keep doing it. And I thank you for it, as I thank everyone whose thoughts, including Eva's ideas, whose aesthetic touch, whose lust of the eyes, and whose metaphysics and connections to atmospheric thinking and being able to participate in this have enriched my life so much.
Isaac?
Well, this has been extraordinary, and it's so nice to be to return back here, and to have this discussion, and it's a great honor. And I was incredibly, of course, I am an artist that's inspired by theory to make works, and to translate those ideas, not as an illustration, but as a transformation. And I was particularly struck by the two things, which is the question of critical intimacy as a kind of form of identification, which creates a kind of knowledge and brings about different forms of identifications which form these entanglements. And of course, I love using the term of Lima Bardi, marvelous entanglement. And I mean, why do I like it? I mean, I like it because I think, there's such a resistance to this marvelous entanglement effect. And so that's why the idea of the atlas and the way that you described that in Giuliana's work, I liked a lot because, I thought it's precisely the atlas and it's through, the images. And I loved the image of the kind of, screen sort of image, because of course, I in a way, I like the idea of critical intimacy as something which can counteract the lust of the eyes, which might develop, as it were, something connected more to the animal spirits, and it's precisely that kind of animal spirits, in that kind of Marxist or kind of, that brings the passions, which is used so successfully by the right, who, in their response to the atlas and the rerouting and remapping that it does through the kind of imagistic sphere that we see ourselves in the world, and the confusion that brings about, the reaction to that, I think, is something, that we haven't quite understood politically, and so I think the failure to understand the networking of that within the atlas map of the world is the problem that is created for ourselves in questions around political identification. And of course that gets appropriated by the right because, of course, the left is resistant to thinking about these ideas in a particular manner. So I like the idea of critical intimacy as against the animal spirits, and then this kind of cartography, which, I feel that Juliana's writing about, that is, very exciting as a way of remapping how we're seeing, that sort of critical relationship to seeing, I think is the thing that has got lost.
Thank you very much. Emanuele.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question for me because, I love relationships, but I hate the concept of relation, but not just because, because of the experience. Normally when someone is speaking about relation, it's bad, in the sense your father or your mother is speaking about relation, then it's just because they are punishing you or they're like about to make you feeling guilty, or when your partner is coming and saying we have to speak about our relationship. Something went wrong. So that's why the concept should perhaps be changed or baptized in another way. But in general, the question, what does a relation represent for me? I would say something perhaps unpopular, but relations are power, a huge amount of power which is given to you or taken from you. A very stupid example, to mention Juliana, before even meeting, I read the book. I hope you understood it. It was really life-changing experience. But you read the book, the Atlas of Emotion. Suddenly you see atlas everywhere, and it's a huge power. You have smart glasses, but even glasses. This object, I'm in relationship with this object. They gave me the power of seeing. Without this, I cannot see. or better fashion. I mean, this shoe or this garment gives me the ability to live, the power of living in Boston, which is very cold, but also they give me the power to appear differently as I am. But coming to what I've spoken about, like Alessandro's kind of explanation of or commentary to Giuliana's work, the problem of relation is that they give you power, but it's complicated because it's not that the one you are related with is in front of you. You are like within the other, and it's a huge mess because you are swimming in the other. You don't understand where you are, so it's like that's why every relationship it's at the same time giving you power and taking you a lot of power, because it's like, and that's why it's beautiful what Alessandro is meaning when he's saying every like other person is an atlas, which is at the same time giving you orientation, but also making you a little bit lost, because it's showing you that the space is much bigger than you understood or that you used to think.
Thank you very much. These were incredibly eloquent responses. I have a number of questions, but I think I'm going to ask only one more question so that we can turn it over to the audience, although I'm very tempted to ask two more questions. But let me just ask the last one. And this is what I want to ask. The title, I'm taking my cue from the title of Isaac's retrospective. This is what freedom is to me. And I want to ask you, how is freedom important to you? How do you associate freedom with? Do you associate freedom with your work, and how does it matter to you? Whether freedom is in the if you see it in your work, in the content of it, in the mode of operation, or in the medium, or in all of it above, and how does it matter?
You want to answer this first, since you came up with that title, not me.
But I think, of course, this is from Nina Simone, what does freedom mean to me? No fear, which I think is, perhaps relevant in this political moment. But I think, that I was thinking about that in the kind of double entendre, I guess, because it was also in relationship to form and the ways in which, form, in relationship to freedom, and its articulation, is also the refusing of, identitarian sort of positions. Even if people sometimes think your work represents that, it's really about the form and the constellation of it, and the refusing of, the fixed gaze and these sorts of questions. They're all questions which are connected to some of the early days of cinema, but I see them as being transposed, into the world atlas, so to speak, in a cognitive sense. So I think it's that relationship between, and I think there's the question of desire, but there's also the question of resistance to these enfoldments. And I think, the question of anxiety in relationship to these questions, it's producing different political positions, which are a resistance to this being able to fashion one's identity, in a dress, for example, so there's a desire to fix all those things. culturally, and I just, so there are all these sorts of questions, so it's not just the kind of liberationist, it begins with that, but then it unfolds into lots of different questionings.
And I think I would totally agree with you about this idea that it's, in some way, is feeling the resistance of the border and not succumbing to it, and turning the border into a boundary, and understanding what a boundary is, and maybe turning the boundary into a membrane, and a membrane into a screen, which is both something that screens in a sense that it allows you to filter, and not just light. It allows you to filter the world. It is a form of resistance because it is a material, and the material has a place, has a texture, has a fabric. But it's also a fabric that allows you to travel through, that allows you for the atlas to exist, for the exterior world to turn into the interior, for I hate to use the word free because they're not free for movements from the outside to the inside, from exteriority through interiority, and that's why I love screens, because they are both something that allows you to feel the resistance, but also to work against that resistance, and that perhaps to me is where I feel that my type of writing fulfills the desire that I have to be able to space out, space out of the place, and being able to make not just those connections, but to make them feel through the style of writing, if it's at all possible, and that's an important thing. I love to write, and perhaps it's the place where I feel sometimes the most free.
Thank you. That was lovely. Emanuele, do you want to take up?
You're asking so simple questions. So what is freedom for me? I would say that freedom is it's like oxygen, in the sense that, the more intense you live, the more oxygen you need. In the case of human society, the more we are, the more freedom we need. So that's why in this particular situation today, as a planetary society, we need a huge amount of freedom. But the problem is that we don't know how to get freedom, in the sense that when you are running, when you are an athlete, you have to learn very precisely how to breathe in order to get a lot of oxygen. And today we don't need, or we forgot how to breathe, in the sense that we are thinking of freedom only on a merely political or legal level, whereby actually the most important technology in the West, at least, for production of freedom that was invented is what we call art. Actually, we totally forgot that, but have you ever asked yourself, why are we using this term art for designing, cinema, writing, theater, sculpture, architecture, practice that had nothing in common, that produce objects which have nothing in common? Why, actually? The reason is an historical reason. Actually, the reason is why, because actually a bunch of people in Italy in the 15th century twisted a very ancient way of defining human activities. As you know, in ancient Greece and in Rome, which were both slaveries, society based on slavery, so activities were divided into activities which were open to only to slaves, like theater, sculptures, and all those, or economy and so on, and activity which were possible only for free men. And men, I'm using men because they were also very sexy societies. So rhetoric, astronomy, and so on. What happened in the 14th, 15th century is that people started to say, no, actually, even sculpting, like chiseling a piece of marble, or even putting pigments on a canvas, which was considered a very poor activity, has to do with our freedom. It's an activity which presupposes freedom and produces freedom. That's why still today, whenever you are going to a museum, you are thinking this contact with art is giving you more freedom. Why? Because it's like a work of art is produced, it presupposes freedom because you have a form which has nothing to do with the destiny of this piece of matter, but it gives you also freedom. So that's why the most important thing today, to my opinion, is to invent those new technologies of freedom, which we used to call since at least, 5 centuries, 6 centuries art.
Thank you. That was wonderful. And now, since it's quite late, we are already a little bit out of time, I would like to turn it to the audience to hear some questions. And one is already emerging there. Do we have mics?
Thanks. Hi, thank you so much. I have a question about space and time, which has been used as a term in combination over and again tonight and since the afternoon. As far as I could hear from Emanuele Coccia's presentation later tonight, what was said was that the matter of space is time, and that pure time is interiority. And traditionally, when I think of time or space-time, I think about time as having been added as the fourth dimension to space as volume. And it seems that in your case, you are kind of inverting that by making the time the thing against that space wraps around and then makes space-time in that way. And so in relationship to an atlas, I was thinking in a globe or some sort of objective map, space-time is pretty consistent across, that you can locate yourself in a particular space and that's steady. But in an atlas where multiple different things are being stitched together, there are different times that are then producing different spaces that need to wrap around them and become somehow stitched together. So I'm wondering, if the term place-time is helpful or useful at all for thinking about how these different components of atlases are generating different forms of time and that are then producing the space-time of the atlas that is nonetheless distinct from the space-time that we normally occupy.
Okay. Giuliana, is this a question for Giuliana or for Emanuele?
Julian, pass it on. It's a tiny question about the nature of space and time. Okay.
You're entitled to brief answers.
Huh?
You're entitled to brief answers.
I don't know. That's hard for me. I write big atlases. I promise one day I'm just going to attempt, a small book, but so far I haven't gotten there yet. I'm going to follow Emanuele's suggestion that one of these days I write like Italians, that one essay becomes a book as opposed to these door stoppers that I'm used to producing. Anyway, so just to connect it to the atlas, right? Since this is what I think your question was referring to. Of course, one of the attraction of the atlas is the possibility of different times and different spaces existing in conjunction together, but also as forms of layering, as kind of geologies, as temporalities that are not linear. And that connects back to this idea of being able to, to think about temporalities in relation to spatiality in a different way. And that's one of the reasons why I love cinema. It's one of the first, mediums that is actually able to produce a different time space or place time, as you call it, by being not just by ways of montage, but in many different ways are allowing you to exist in different forms, in different time, in different spaces. And so the cinematic and the atlas have a connection in relation to this possible production of something that is not understanding time as separate from space, but in a way creating a kind of temporal geography. And a lot of the maps are maps that especially the carte tendre, the map of Madeleine de Scudéry, have that sense obviously embedded into it, because you're traveling, through space, but you're also traveling, it takes time, you're traveling through time, and through that you're discovering different temporalities, which are also in different forms of interiorities. And so there's another aspect of this question that is not just geographic, but it has to do with the kind of perception, the internal perception, and to the collections of memories in some way. That's one of the things that connects us together, and especially, with Isaac, the idea of the marvelous entanglement of time and space is also something that's created in the form of exhibition, as a form of collection that invites recollection. And so, to your point, Emanuele, that we to rethink art in that way means also seeing what's happening in the museum itself as a place that allows for this different time space to exist, if you can do what Lina Bobardi did, which is to say to invent ways to see in time and in space that are not juxtaposed, but that allow for this kind of conjunction to produce a different form of space-time.
Okay, any other questions?
Did we exhaust everybody? Yeah, we did. Okay, I have a question for Emanuele. No, it's a very simple one. I was asking simple questions that have enormous, and this is really simple. Why I am so delighted that that artists respond to what I do, right? That there is a kind of creative reciprocity and receptivity in what happens. It's one of the things that makes me the happiest about what I've done, is that it's not just scholars but it's artists as well as fashion designers or architects or even musicians. I was delighted that Michael Nyman made music inspired by atlases, all kinds of different interesting sort of connections that happen in this sort of generative form. But I don't understand why is it I never got a dress. I mean, being that I'm such a fashion addict, the idea that Alessandro Michele did the whole damn collection inspired by Atlas of Emotion and plastered the Italian cover of my book onto this woman's body and didn't think about giving this particular woman a dress that I could wear tonight is crazy.
Hello. Now, as you know, it's too late because Alessandro is now by Valentino, so it's too late. But I have an answer, because as the Christian theology teaches us, the dress of glory is the best and most important dress. So you are now dressed out of glory. You don't need the dresses made out of vulgar textile and fabric.
I would second Giuliana by saying, glory is best when it's materialized.
Hello.
I hope, hint, hint. All right. Well, I think this was an extraordinarily rich evening, and we have really much food for thought. So perhaps this is a moment when we should thank all the participants. First and foremost, Giuliana, who's generated this event by her work, and Isaac, Julien, and Emanuele Coccia. So please join me in an applause.